Everyone, this is Adicon Podfic, back on another podfic. Today I'll be reading The Storm That Unfolded by pt.13, and this will be Chapter 14, A Nest, or Two. Summary. Gojo interrupts his very important researching time to be his companion on a mission he definitely does not need help on. Or maybe he does, because the building across the road housed a curse that just pulled a little boy inside. Let's get right into it. Now Percy would always be the first to admit he struggled in school. ADHD aside, academia had never really interested him, until now it turned out that the metaphorical axe over his neck, which he felt a lot like the literal axe that had somehow ended up with him arriving in Japan after it hit his neck, triumphed over all else. He needed to come up with a reasonable backstory that could explain his powers and the lack of knowledge about him. He wanted it tied somewhat to his actual past, less to keep track of then, and fewer things he'd have to make up, but he couldn't exactly explain the truth. He'd done extensive research already to see if anyone he knew was around, and he found absolutely zero record of them at all. Zero. They had seemingly never even been born. He knew for a fact that majority of demigods had a birth certificate. They had one mortal parent, after all. Maybe New Rome was different, but at the very least, the Camp Half-Blood demigods should have some record of existence, but they didn't. In fact, he couldn't even find records of the mortal parents, including his mom. The only conclusion he could make was that he had somehow gotten to somewhere else entirely. The only comfort he had was that the people who had slaughtered them would never find him here. He could leave it all behind him. He still had to find a believable reason for his existence here, though. The Kamo were supplying tomes for him, which he reluctantly accepted, though he kept those in his room. Typically, though, he often found himself huddled in the library, cramming every sorcerer book for anything known about but obscure enough that he could use as his heritage. Nanami's tip/peace offering had helped him too, more than he wanted to admit, but he was slowly piecing together a story, and he hoped he had enough time to come up with something before the next interrogation came on. This was where Gojo found him. Percy had been too focused to hear his phone ringing, apparently, which he had only accepted with great reluctance once the wealthy sorcerer kept shoving it in his pocket on account of how important it was. He was contactable at all times, and only after he tested the danger it posed enough to calm the drilled-in demigod no-no of technology. So the white-haired man had come looking, probably to grab him again. "Come on!" His voice was irritatingly bright. "Let's go on an adventure." "No, thank you," Percy responded, turning the page. "Didn't take you for such a party bum." Gojo pulled the book from his hands. "Come on, it'll be fun." Percy side-eyed him before sighing and gathering the small pile of books. He shelved them begrudgingly, noting down the title of each despite knowing he'll probably forget them anyway, and then grumpily following a too-cheery Gojo outside. The building was exactly what he expected, abandoned, half-sunken in decay, the walls pulsing with residual cursed energy. The moment they stepped inside, curses slithered from the shadows, eager and waiting. Gojo tilted his head back with an exaggerated sigh. "All right, time to get to work." Percy, however, simply leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He had no reason to interfere. Gojo paused mid-step, glancing over his shoulder. "You're seriously not going to help?" Percy shrugged. "Not my mission, and we both know you're more than capable of doing it yourself. I'm just here so you're not alone, as you so begged for company." Gojo made a disgusted noise and turned back to the nest in front of him. He wasted no time, moving through the nest with effortless ease. Every flick of his wrist, every casual step, was a death sentence for the curses swarming around him. The air split with violent bursts of energy, flickers of limitless, sending bodies flying. Percy rolled his eyes and looked around the street instead. Gojo was frankly overkill, as one could usually expect of the white-haired sorcerer. He was about to tune out entirely when something caught his eye. Across the street, barely visible through the shattered glass of another building, something moved. Curses lingered at the windows. Percy barely registered them before he saw what they were dragging inside. A child. His body reacted before his mind finished processing. Without a word, without waiting for Gojo to finish, he left the building. In fact, the sound of a massacre echoed dully in his ears as he headed to the building across the street, his strides confident and strong. The moment Percy stepped inside, he was met with the foul stench of decay. It was not as dark as the last building, probably why it had been missed in favor of the first one, but the shadows were still thick with cursed energy. There were two curses his eyes were immediately drawn to. They were dragging the boy, maybe 6 or 7, through the hall. A hunched skeletal curse had him by the wrist, and the second curse slithered behind him, clicking its claws. The second curse latched onto the boy's arm, and the boy screamed for a moment before his face went slack, dazed, shock and pain setting in, pupils unfocused as blood dripped from the gaping wound. Percy felt disgusted, both with the curse and himself. He had been too slow. The curse tightened its grip, its jagged teeth parting in a grotesque grin. Percy lunged forward, water swirling at his fingertips and slashing outward in an arc. It curved clean through the curse's wrist, severing the hand from its arm and causing it to drop the boy in the process. He fell with a hard thud, and Percy winced as the impact on his head, noting to check it over once he was done here. A dozen other curses slithered closer. Sensing fresh prey, Percy's jaw tightened. He reached for the water sitting in the rusted pipes between the walls and pulled, letting it swirl around him. A flick of his wrist sent a torrent slamming into the nearest curse, crushing it against the far wall. Another lunge from the side. Percy sidestepped and sent a sharp burst of water straight through its chest. One after another, he cut them down, moving with precision that had come from years of destroying monsters and curses alike. Shards of ice were sent flying through their bodies, leaving them full of more holes than Swiss cheese. Others had the traces of water inside their body expand, causing them to explode. Blades of water chopped them to pieces, and others were straight up stabbed with his good old celestial dagger. In a span of minutes, all he was left with were the two biggest ones, the ones that had grabbed the kid. The skeletal curse hissed, baring jagged teeth in a grotesque mockery of a grin. Its remaining bony fingers curled like talons, dark veins of cursed energy pulsing beneath its translucent skin. Beside it, the slithering curse coiled itself low to the ground, its limbs twitching. Percy exhaled, his heart pounded in his ears, but his breathing remained steady. The skeletal curse lunged first, a blur of jagged claws and snapping teeth. Percy pivoted, ducking under the swipe and driving his dagger forward. The celestial bronze blade plunged deep into its ribs, but instead of staggering back, the curse shrieked and twisted, trying to bring its other clawed hand down on him. Percy wrenched his dagger free and flung his other hand up. Water shot from his palm, condensing midair into a solid sheet of ice that slammed against the curse's descending limb. The impact shattered the ice, but it brought Percy a split second to jump backwards, narrowly avoiding the strike as shards of ice rained around him. The slithering curse shot forward, its elongated body stretching, and Percy barely had time to raise an arm before it coiled around his torso, squeezing like a constrictor. His ribs groaned in protest, but he ignored them. Instead, clenching his fist and calling the melting ice at his feet, he condensed it in his palm, hardening it into a jagged spike of ice. He drove it into the curse's side, causing it to let out a shriek, its grip faltering. Percy didn't waste the opportunity, snapping his arm free and driving his hands outward, unleashing a violent burst of pressurized water. The force sent the curse flying backwards, its body slamming into the nearest wall with a sickening crunch. Percy barely had a moment to breathe before the skeletal curse was on him again, its empty eye sockets glowing red with malice. This time, it moved faster, swiping at him in rapid succession. Forcing him to stay on the defensive, claws tore through the air, narrowly missing his face. Percy ducked and rolled, twisting to the side before bringing his foot up in a brutal kick. The curse staggered, but Percy didn't give it the chance to recover. Instead, extending both arms and calling to the water he could feel below him, he shot it upwards, right into the path of the charging curse, encasing it entirely in a geyser. He froze it with a snap of his fingers, parting the section at the base of its skull, and rammed his dagger into the space, causing it to sag and then wither away inside the ice prison. A guttural snarl drew his attention. The slithering curse had recovered, its wounds already knitting together. Percy scowled and barely refrained from rolling his eyes. Of course this one would have regenerative abilities. Fine, he'd make sure it wouldn't get the chance to heal again. The curse lunged, moving faster than before, but he braced himself before at the last possible moment. He dropped low, sliding beneath the curse's outstretched arms. As he moved, he gathered the water still pooling around them, shaping it to a single razor-thin whip. He twisted, bringing his arm down in a clean arc, slashing it through the curse's midsection. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a wet, sickening crunch, the curse split in half, its upper body tumbling forward, arms still reaching for him, while its lower half crumpled behind it. It was still alive, but as it turned to crawl pitifully towards him, body trying to thread itself together again, he slammed an ice spear through its skull. The body twitched for a moment before melting into a puddle of darkness and fading out of sight. Percy exhaled sharply, his heart still pounding in his chest. He turned to the child, who had collapsed against the wall, trembling. "Hey," he said gently, trying to soothe the terrified child. "It's okay now, kid. They're gone. Can you show me your arm?" The boy didn't answer for a moment, still in shock. Percy could see the blood dripping, though, and slowly reached out to grip the tiny wrist. Percy grimaced as he saw the exposed bone and rested a hand just above the wound. He pulled clean water from a nearby puddle, boiling it for a moment to kill any bacteria inside, and then manipulated it so it wrapped around his hand. He pressed it to the wound, whispering a soft, shushing sound as the kid winced. The water simmered, and Percy watched as, slowly, the bleeding stopped and the boy's skin knitted together, the deep gash fading into an angry red scar. The kid gasped, staring at his arm in wide-eyed disbelief. Percy pushed himself to his feet. "Go home, and don't—" A slow, deliberate clap echoed from the entrance. Percy stiffened. Gojo leaned against the doorway, grinning. "That was quite the show!" Percy scowled. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." Gojo gestured lazily to the remains of the nest. You sure you're not going to help? Because that looked a lot like helping. Percy rolled his eyes, but for a moment ignored the man, focusing instead on the kid. Run home quickly now, and don't tell anyone, okay? It's a secret. He pressed his finger to his lips, the universal sign of a secret. The kid copied the motion and then darted around him and ran out the door. Gojo chuckled, stepping aside to let the boy pass. As Percy followed him out the door, Gojo clapped a hand on his shoulder. You know, you're getting harder and harder to turn a blind eye on. Maturely, Percy ignored him. Chapter 15. Cough Drops. Percy shifted his stance, smoothly flipping Panda over his shoulder. The training room was full with the dull thuds of students landing, repositioning, and trying again. His Aikido lessons had started small, but more people were beginning to show up, drawn in by the promise of a fighting style that didn't rely on brute force or cursed energy alone. It was practical, adaptable, a way to fight smarter, not harder, but one person was noticeably, at least for Percy, absent. Percy had seen Inumaki attend a few times, lurking at the edge of the room, watching, but hardly ever participating. Considering how much strain her speech seemed to put on his body, Percy had figured out of everyone here he'd get the most out of learning alternative methods of fighting. But when he asked some of the students who knew Inumaki, they'd all said the same thing. He doesn't really need to. He can just speak and his enemies drop. That answer sat wrong with Percy. His demigod background had demanded proficiency in so many different skills. If you were a one-trick pony, then no matter how good your trick may be, once it was done, you just became dead weight. It was harsh, but very real perspective to have for the nature of the world they were in. A world not all that dissimilar to this one, at least where it mattered. Later that evening, he found himself in the library, poring over whatever he could find about the Toge clan and their powers. The more he read, the more it reminded him of Piper's charm speak. The principle was different, sure, but the limitations were familiar, forcing the world to bend with your words at a cost. And if there was one thing Percy understood, it was that raw power, without control, would burn you out fast. And you may even take some of your friends out with you. He started considering ways to help. His first thoughts wandered down endurance. How many words could be uttered before he gave out? How did the word itself affect his energy reserves? Could he take medication to ease the damage, and if so, which kind worked best? At the very least, Inumaki needed to learn hand-to-hand combat. If Percy could achieve absolute nada regarding his cursed speech technique, then he wanted the kid to hold his own in ways that didn't rely on it. He learned it himself the hard way, after all. He found Inumaki outside, leaning against a tree, scrolling through his phone. Percy came to a stop just before him and waited for the teen to look up at him. "Summon?" he asked with a questioning tilt of his head. Percy considered him for a moment. He held out a notepad and pen and sat down next to him after Inumaki had taken it. "I need your help understanding something. Mind writing it down?" Inumaki raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Percy continued. "From what I understand of how cursed speech works, the words compel the listener to perform or experience the action, and the strength of the compulsion depends on your skill level." Inumaki nodded. "How do you increase your skill level?" Inumaki nodded, then jotted something down. "Skill level grows with practice. More experience using it equals stronger effect. Also depends on my cursed energy reserves." Percy's brow furrowed as he read the ink. "And using it hurts you, right?" Another nod. "Is there any way you can reduce the damage or heal it?" "Can't really stop it. Strains vocal cords no matter what. Medicine helps afterwards, but doesn't prevent damage." "How many words can you use before it hurts too much? Do the words you use matter?" "Depends. About 2 to 4 phrases in a row before voice starts to crack. Stronger words equal stronger backlash. If the target has higher passive cursed energy than me, they can resist or block it if they know it's coming, though that awareness is rare." Percy hummed in thought before glancing back up. "Can I ask why you don't come to my training sessions, then? I'd have thought of everyone here, you and Maki would have the most to gain." Inumaki blinked, then shrugged before responding. "I don't need to fight hand-to-hand. I just say what I want. If it works, fight's over. If it doesn't, I run." Percy exhaled sharply. "No offense, Toge, but I disagree. In my experience, everyone needs to have a range of skills, and any ranged specialist, which is what I'd consider you to be, has to have hand-to-hand experience, too, in case they either run out of ammo or are ambushed in close quarters. Running would mean death, so standing and fighting is essential." Inumaki stared at him, his expression unreadable. "I don't want to claim I know more than you about how your powers work, but I believe you have a greater potential than you're currently reaching for. Would you consider doing some training with me?" Inumaki tilted his head, considering, so Percy rushed to continue before the teen decided to walk off. "I'd really like to see you improve, not only your hand-to-hand combat, but also your cursed speech. What if we worked on increasing the number of words you could use before your voice goes out? Maybe we could figure out which words are more efficient, ones that use less energy but still get the job done." Inumaki's brows furrowed. He tapped the pen against his knee, eyes flickering between Percy and the notepad before finally writing. "Never thought of it that way. No one's trained cursed speech like that before." Then, after a pause, he added, "Might be worth testing." Percy grinned. While we're at it, we should look at making you a field kit. Inamaki glanced up, intrigued. If you have some medicine on hand, then if you get into a fight that's longer or harder than you expected, you'll have something to help you recover. Who knows, different types of medicine might help in a pinch. Inamaki's eyes widened slightly, an expression Percy could only label as surprise, like the idea had never crossed his mind, which, honestly, was baffling. To Percy, not having a med kit on hand was asking for disaster. He'd never gone on a quest without ambrosia or nectar. Hell, even without that, he'd still had first aid supplies. The thought of walking into battle with no backup plan made his skin crawl. He could heal himself with water if he needed to. For demigods, no med kit meant no way of healing someone who did get injured out in the field, and they could die from that. It was a pointless death that could have so easily been prevented, so the sorcerer's attitudes towards it boggled and horrified him. Sure, some had reverse curse technique apparently, but those who didn't, and even those who did but were hurt by something non-cursed, would need it anyway, wouldn't they? What do you say? Percy asked as he stood and offered a hand. Inumaki studied him for a second before gripping his hand and pulling himself up. Salmon, he said, voice steady, his posture straighter than before. Percy smirked. Good, let's get to work. Percy spent the next couple hours putting together a proper lesson plan. It was different from how he usually structured his Aikido sessions. This wasn't just about movement, but endurance and efficiency. Not to mention that it would also focus on a curse technique, something he deliberately avoided touching on with his other students. He broke the overall plan into a few different sections, wanting to focus on particular aspects at different stages. Today would be all about obtaining a baseline performance. Percy wanted to know what Inumaki could currently do, so they could track how progress was being made. Percy set the training ground with a small notebook in hand, the pages already filled with notes from his research on cursed speech. Inumaki stood across from him, arms crossed, looking a little skeptical but willing to humor him. All right, Percy said, flipping to a fresh page. Let's get a baseline. You don't usually train this, right? Inumaki shook his head. Yeah, figured. Since your technique doesn't require practice to work, you probably don't see much reason to. But what about endurance? You ever measured how many commands you can give before you're totally shot? Inumaki hesitated. Percy took that as a no. We'll start simple. Try using a command on that target dummy. Something low effort, like sit. Inumaki nodded and turned to the training dummy. Sit. The dummy sat. Percy nodded, scribbling something down. Okay, so it works on inanimate objects. Good. Let's see how many words you can use before your throat starts killing you. Inumaki managed to jump, fall, roll, and throw before he winced and placed a hand against his throat. Percy frowned, marking it down. That's 5 basic words before the strain sets in. If they'd been stronger commands, it would have been even worse, right? Inumaki gave a tired nod, pulling out his notepad. I could probably manage 1 or 2 more, but I'd risk breaking it or damaging myself permanently. Percy clicked his tongue. I'll go shopping and find a few different remedies that might help, and we can assess how effective they are. Sorry I haven't got any right now, but I did bring some lemon, honey, and ginger tea, which works on sore throats normally. If that doesn't work, I can try and heal you with my powers. Inumaki raised an eyebrow, but otherwise made no comment. Instead, reaching for the offered cup and taking a sip, he gave a sigh of relief as he swallowed and grabbed the pen and paper to scribble something down. Doesn't heal it, but it does provide relief. Thanks. Percy offered a small smile. You're welcome. So far, you get about 5 solid commands before your voice breaks, and that would drop to 3, 4 if they were stronger words or against stronger opponents. We'll keep testing to see if we can push that number higher. Inumaki studied him, then wrote, You're really invested in this. Percy shrugged. I've seen what happens when people rely too much on one power. It's better to know your limits before someone finds them out for you. When you're ready, we can move on to hand-to-hand combat. I'd like to see where we should begin. The teen nodded, and when he'd finished his tea, indicated they could start. Percy had him go through basic movements, assessing his form. It was clear Inumaki was quick. His footwork was light, adaptive, and well-practiced. That made sense. Someone who had to rely on their voice rather than raw strength or technique would naturally develop an instinct for movement. But there was hesitation in his strikes, a lack of commitment. When he threw a punch or a kick, his blocks were weak, relying more on avoidance than proper deflection, which Percy noted immediately. Percy circled around him, watching the way Inumaki shifted his weight. You're good at getting out of the way, but if someone forces you into a corner, you're done for. Inumaki raised a brow, adjusting his stance slightly as Percy tapped the inside of his ankle with his foot. Too narrow. Easier to knock him off balance. Have you ever been in a fight where you couldn't use cursed speech? Percy asked. Inumaki hesitated, then shook his head. That's a problem, and I don't want the first time you experience it to be your last moment alive. An unfortunate reality of the world we're in, I'm afraid. Percy stepped forward in a slow but deliberate movement, forcing Inumaki to react. The teen took a step back and then another. Percy adjusted his angle, cutting off his retreat, making him react faster. With nowhere left to go, Inumaki raised an arm to block, but Percy caught his wrist, twisting it lightly to demonstrate an opening in his defense. "See," Percy said, releasing him just as fast. "You move well, but your defenses are too shallow. Right now, if someone blitzes you, all you can do is retreat. You need to learn how to push back." Inumaki let out a soft hum, rolling his wrist before nodding. Percy spent the next hour focusing on counterattacks, teaching Inumaki how to redirect force instead of just dodging outright. He drilled him on quick escapes, small shifts in position that could turn an enemy's strength against them. Instead of absorbing the full impact of a strike, he had Inumaki practice guiding attacks past him, using an opponent's momentum to create an opening for himself. His movements were sharp, controlled, but still lacked confidence. He hesitated when striking back, as if second-guessing his ability to land a solid hit. Percy had him run the drills again, adjusting his position, making slight corrections until the motions flowed smoother. "Don't overthink it," Percy said when Inumaki faltered during a drill. "You're aiming for efficiency, not power. Think of it like speaking. Short, direct, effective. If you hesitate, your opponent will take advantage of it." After another half hour, Percy finally stepped back and nodded in approval. "All right, good work. We'll pick this up again tomorrow. Rest your voice, and I'll bring some remedies to try out tomorrow." Inumaki let out a quiet sigh, but there was something more solid in his posture now, like he was already taking on the adjustments Percy had made. Over the next 2 weeks, the pair spent around an hour together every day, trying different words, combinations of words, and on different objects. The remedies they'd been trying now had tangible results, too. The throat spray provided instant relief, but didn't last long, and was best for short-term use when Inumaki only needed 1 or 2 more words. The lozenges eased irritation gradually, but he had to suck on them for a while before they worked. They also granted another word or two, so it would be ideal to have after a fight in case another one popped up a short while later. Cooling strips helped reduce swelling in his throat, but seemed best after a fight for reduced recovery rather than during. The cough syrup, expectedly, had no effect given he wasn't actually coughing, and unsurprisingly, the corticosteroids were the most effective, though naturally were decided to keep as a last resort given the extensive list of side effects. It meant they could make up a small kit that Inumaki could wear when he went out. It was small and light enough that he barely noticed wearing it, and yet he could now carry with him some emergency medication and relief in case he ever did end up needing it. Percy took careful notes on when each worked best and how often Inumaki could use them without side effects, including a little information card inside the pouch in case someone found him unconscious and could help treat him. It also provided Inumaki with an understanding of how they worked and when he could and should not use them. Meanwhile, they continued testing how different words affected his stamina. Some, like stop or freeze, were less draining than commands like explode or crush. Shorter words helped. Repeating the same word seemed to wear him out faster, reinforcing the idea that curse speech was not just about the command itself, but how the energy behind it was exerted. "Looks like efficiency is the key," Percy noted, flipping through his pages of notes. "If we refine your word choices, you'll get more out of your techniques before it backfires on you." But Percy wasn't just interested in optimizing efficiency. He wanted to increase Inumaki's overall reserve. There would be situations where conserving strength wouldn't be an option. If he needed to use multiple powerful commands in a row, he couldn't afford to burn out after just a few. To push his limits, Percy had him practice chaining stronger words together in bursts, allowing just enough time between each command to gauge how quickly his voice degraded. Hit the dummy with crush, then shatter, then break. Inumaki did as instructed, each word striking the target harder. By the time he reached the third command, he was already gripping his throat, wincing at the strain. Percy jotted down notes, nodding to himself. "All right, you can get 2 strong ones out comfortably, but a third sends you into the red. We need to push that threshold." They worked on gradual increases, adding a 4th word in some sets, sometimes shifting the order to see if a different sequence made a difference, but simply rearranging words wasn't enough. If they wanted to push past his limits, they needed a more structured approach. Percy decided that over the next few sessions, they'd try several variations and combinations to see which, if any, methods would either increase Inumaki's energy reserves, the number of words he could output, or the strength of the words he could output. For some gradual conditioning, Percy had Inumaki start using strong commands at lower intensity, almost like weight training. Instead of unleashing a full-power explode 3 times in a row, he made him build up to it, starting with push or shove before increasing to slam, crush, and finally explode. This way, Inumaki could strengthen his vocal cords and curse energy output without immediately overwhelming himself. Percy would have him experiment with pacing, spreading out strong commands instead of firing them off in rapid succession. He'd say crush, then count to 5 before saying break. Then they reduced the gap to 4 seconds, then 3. If Inumaki could train himself to maintain control under strain, he might be able to stretch his reserves further. Since speaking itself was tied to his stamina, Percy introduced breath control exercises, borrowing from Aikido and martial arts techniques. Inumaki practiced controlling his breath before and after using cursed speech, as theoretically it could reduce the amount of strain he placed on his vocal cords and with each command. They experimented with the fourth behind each word. Was shouting necessary? Could he whisper and explode and still get the same effect? Could he limit the area of effect by lowering his voice? The results were mixed. Whispering made it easier to use more words, but reduced their impact, especially if the target couldn't hear it. However, if he could master that balance, he might be able to stretch his reserves further without completely blowing out his voice. It also made him realize that different contexts, such as if he were in close quarters with a curse, then he only needed to whisper the command for it to register, which would reduce the backlash on himself. Not every command drained him equally. Explode hit hard but tired him quickly, while burst had a similar effect but used slightly less energy. Percy had him cycle through synonyms, finding alternatives that were easier on his throat but still packed enough punch. I'd consider talking to Shoko as well on how to use reverse curse technique, then you might be able to actually heal yourself mid-fight if necessary, Percy said to a student as they rested after a session. Inumaki's intrigued look told Percy that this was another thing no one had apparently considered. Was no one here ever pushed to be adaptive and extrapolate anything? Honestly, sometimes Percy marveled any were still even alive. Still, he added it to his list of things to follow up. Tomorrow we'll move to a live target. Now we've got a good idea of your technique itself. I think we need to consider the second variability, your targets. Inumaki blinked at him. I know you said the target matters, which makes sense, of course, but so far we've only been looking at the curse speech itself and its application towards inanimate objects. He waved over the pile of wood lumps from the various destroyed dummies. Inumaki waved his hands and shrugged his shoulders in a way that indicated he was asking how. Percy grinned. We'll start off simple again, so pick me. I want to see if I can control my passive energy output anyway. So this will help me control that, while allowing you to experiment with a target of varying passive cursed energy. He got a disbelieving look at his words, making Percy chuckle. Don't worry about me. Like I said, we'll start with basic commands, and in the unlikely scenario I do get hurt, I heal up easily enough. When we go to the harsher words, though, I'll convince Ijichi-san to source some smaller curses for you to experiment with. Seemingly reluctantly, Inumaki nodded, and the next day they found themselves back in their training room. Percy stood a few feet away, hands on his hips, watching as Inumaki fidgeted slightly. The teen had no issues in cursed speech on objects, but there was a distinct hesitation when faced with a living person, especially when that person was staring at him expectantly, waiting to be commanded with an attack. Percy smirked. You look like you're about to apologize before even doing anything. Inumaki huffed through his nose, shifting his stance. Come on, Percy urged. Just a simple one, something you know won't hurt. Inumaki exhaled, then sit. Percy's legs folded beneath him in an instant, his body dropping into a cross-legged position before he could resist. He blinked. Huh. Inumaki watched closely, eyes scanning Percy's form for any signs of strain or discomfort. Percy gave an approving nod. Yeah, that was weird, but I felt it. There was resistance, like an outside force pushing my body into the motion. He stretched his arms behind his head. Let's do it again, but this time almost with my cursed energy output. Inumaki nodded, already intrigued. Percy shifted, relaxing his shoulders. This was something he had practiced before, keeping his energy output suppressed, making himself unreadable to sorcerers and curses alike. But that was a more instinctual hide than any conscious decision. But keeping it steady while allowing slight fluctuations, that was a different story. Okay, Percy said, focusing on increasing his passive curse energy. Go. Sit. This time, Percy almost resisted. His muscles twitched, but the force still pressed down, guiding him into a seated position. Not bad, he muttered, rubbing his chin. It definitely felt weaker that time, but not by much. They repeated the process, Percy raising and lowering his energy in different increments. Percy took notes on how his technique responded, based on Inumaki's observations at seeing the minute differences in every effort and effect. By the time Percy felt like he had a decent grasp, Inumaki had gone through about a dozen uses of sit, and his voice was definitely feeling it. So they called it a day, but 12 was a remarkable improvement from when they'd started. Ramping things up the next day involved stronger commands, and once again Inumaki's expressions warred between nervous and excited. You ready? Percy asked, shaking out his arms. Inumaki rolled his shoulders, then nodded. Percy exhaled, adjusting his stance. All right, start light, then build up. Inumaki took a breath. Launch back. The force slammed into Percy's chest, and he had just enough cursed energy wrapped around himself to dampen it. His feet still slid a few inches, but he remained standing. Inumaki tilted his head, noting the resistance. Percy smirked. Okay, that felt different. Again. Launch. This time, Percy tried to suppress his cursed energy mid-command, but he mistimed it. His energy wavered, and the next thing he knew, he was airborne. His back hit the dirt with a solid thud. Ow. Inumaki's shoulders shook with silent laughter. He tapped his throat, signaling that he had plenty of use left in him for this one. Percy groaned, rolling to his feet. All right, again. They went through it several more times, Percy struggling to hit the right balance. The moment he overcorrected Inumaki's command would send him skidding for outright flying, but when he had too much energy, the command barely affected him at all. It was frustrating. His instincts were too good at sealing everything up, keeping his presence wrapped tight, like he was used to hiding. But shifting his cursed energy output actively in the moment was different. Eventually, he landed flat on his back again and stayed there for a second, staring up at the sky. This is harder than I thought. Inumaki leaned over him, smirking. You suck at this, was etched clearly into his far too lethal expression. Percy groaned, throwing an arm over his face. Yeah, give me a sec, I'll get it. When he sat up, brushing dirt off his shirt, Inumaki lifted an eyebrow. One more? It asked. Percy grinned and nodded. This time, when Inumaki spoke, Percy felt it coming. He shifted his cursed energy smoothly, just enough resistance to stay grounded, but not so much that he nullified the force entirely, just letting it wash around him like a river parting around a boulder. He dug his feet in and stood firm, not getting launched into the dirt. In fact, his feet didn't even slip back. Inumaki's eyes widened slightly, and Percy laughed. Gotcha. Now that Percy was beginning to really control his output, and Inumaki was getting experience in targeting an opponent of various passive energy levels, it was time to go all out. And this time, Percy was not going to be on the receiving end. True to his words, he had convinced EGT to help source some little curses for Percy to collect, and one by one, Percy brought them into the enclosed arena for target practice. Percy adjusted his grip on the squirming, malformed curse in his hands, scowling as it snapped at his fingers. All right, Ugly, let's get this over with. He tossed it into the training area, where it skittered across the ground, its shadowy limbs twitching. Inumaki stood a few feet away, adjusting the scarf around his throat, eyes locked on the curse as it snarled at him. Percy cracked his knuckles. Okay, we know how your speech works on me. Now let's see how these things handle it. We'll start light, then move up to stronger commands. That way we can measure how quickly you burn through your stamina before hitting your limit. Inumaki nodded, inhaling deeply. Stop. The curse lurched, its body freezing mid-motion. Percy watched intently, noting how its limbs twitched as it tried to move but couldn't. Nice. That took hold fast. Any strain? Inumaki shook his head. Percy grinned. Good. Release it, then try crush. The curse let out a garbled screech as it broke free, but Inumaki was faster. Crush. The effect was immediate. The curse's body caved in as though unseen hands were squeezing it from all sides. It shrieked, limbs flailing before it collapsed, body crumbling into itself until it was little more than a pile of distorted, pulpy flesh. Percy whistled. Damn, that's effective. Inumaki exhaled sharply, one hand coming up to his throat. Percy was already watching closely. That one got you a bit, huh? A nod. Percy jotted down a quick note in his book. Okay, you're still within your usual limit, though. Think you can do another? Inumaki rolled his shoulders, determination flicking in his eyes. Good. Percy motioned to the side. Next one. He left the training arena for a moment and returned with another small curse. It flailed in his grip, hissing as Percy tossed it into the arena. All right, Percy said. Go again, but this time, let's jump straight to Shatter. I want to see how much recoil you get from something stronger right away. Inumaki inhaled, bracing himself. Shatter. The curse convulsed, then it exploded. Bits of dark mist and viscera splattering across the ground. The impact was more violent than crush, and the aftershock was clear. Inumaki immediately staggered, gripping his throat with a wince. Percy was at his side in a second. Throat check, Percy ordered, tilting his head. Pain scale? Inumaki gave him a flat look. Percy smirked. Yeah, I know you can't say it. Hold up fingers. Inumaki raised 3 fingers, then hesitated before lifting a 4th. All right, 4. Worse than crush, but not a full-on shutdown. Percy scribbled another note. We'll get to the heavier words soon, but let's try for endurance first. If you need a break, take it. Otherwise, let's go again. Inumaki flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders as he straightened. He wasn't tapping out just yet. Percy grinned. Good. Then let's keep pushing the threshold. And so, they continued. Each session he found slightly stronger curses, making each command more taxing. Percy observed closely, adjusting their training pace when needed, but always ensuring they were moving forward. They had to be ready, because when the real fight came, hesitation wasn't an option, and he refused to let someone go down when he knew he could help. Inamaki's hand-to-hand was improving too. Percy had introduced a knife into their training sessions, a lightweight blade meant for quick, precise movements rather than brute force. At first, Inamaki had been awkward with it, too used to relying on distance rather than close-quarters fighting, but Percy drilled him on grip, stance, and movement, making sure every strike was controlled and efficient. You're fast, so a dagger works better than a heavier weapon. Percy explained as Inamaki tested its weight. If you get cornered, use it to create an opening, then get out. Remember, the point is, at least for now, is so you can hold your own in a fight without needing your words. Inamaki nodded and tried the techniques again. Percy frowned when they had to pause again for Inamaki to catch his breath. You're not trying to overpower them, he reminded him. Just like with your speech, you want short, decisive actions. Don't waste movement, or as you can see, you'll just exhaust yourself. It took time, but the improvement was visible. His strikes became sharper, his ability to switch between bare-handed combat and using the knife became more fluid. He wasn't a master by any means, but he was no longer a relatively easy target either. 2 months since their training had begun, Inamaki had already progressed significantly. Not only could he say more words before his voice gave out, but he had a much greater understanding of which words worked best. They had incorporated Aikido concepts into his speech, redirecting and deflecting instead of brute force attacks, though they had also discussed scenarios where all-out force was necessary. His hand-to-hand combat had come a long way as well. While he wasn't ready to go toe-to-toe with a seasoned fighter, he could at least hold his own against weaker opponents. More importantly, he had learned to make space, enough to regain control of a fight or get his voice back into play. Percy knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he was certain, if Inamaki kept this up, he'd be a real problem for anyone who underestimated him. Percy sat across from Shoko, arms crossed as Inamaki sipped his tea beside him. She had listened to their requests without interrupting, her usual tired expression unreadable now. She exhaled a long breath and leaned back in her chair. You want me to teach Toge-san the reverse curse technique? She repeated flatly. Percy nodded. Yeah, his cursed speech wears down his throat fast, and we're hitting a limit on how much he can push through it. If he can heal himself even a little, he could last longer in fights. Shoko turned her gaze to Inamaki, who gave her a small nod in confirmation. She studied him for a moment before sighing. You do realize how difficult this is, right? She said. Reverse curse technique isn't something you just learn overnight. Even most sorcerers can't do it. You need fine control, the ability to flip negative energy into positive, and on top of that, enough reserves to sustain it. Percy wasn't deterred. He doesn't need to be a healer like you. He just needs enough to keep his voice from giving out mid-fight. Shoko was quiet for a long moment, then rolled her eyes. Fine, I'll teach you the basics, but don't expect miracles. She stood, motioning for them to follow her to another room. Inside, she pulled up a chair and gestured for Inamaki to sit across from her. All right, she started, lacing her fingers together. The first thing you need to understand is that normal curse energy is destructive. It's meant to harm, not heal. That's why reverse curse technique is so hard. You're forcing it to do the opposite of its nature. She raised a hand, summoning a small flicker of energy in her palm. It was warm, unlike the usual cold, oppressive feeling of cursed energy. To do this, you have to take negative energy and loop it back into itself to create positive energy. Most people struggle because it takes an insane amount of control. Gojo does it instinctively because he's a downright all-powerful bastard. Yuta can do it because he has massive reserves. The rest of us? She smirked. We have to work for it. Inamaki nodded, watching intently. Percy could see the gears turning in his head. He was analyzing the technique, already breaking it down the way he did with cursed speech. Shoko motioned for him to try. At first, nothing happened. Inamaki focused, trying to summon his cursed energy, but no matter how hard he tried, it stayed the same. Negative, sharp, destructive. His fingers twitched, frustration flickering in his expression. Shoko hummed. That's normal. You're trying to force it to do too much. Instead of pushing, let it cycle back. Try again, but slower. Inamaki closed his eyes, concentrating. This time, Percy could feel a small shift in the air. It wasn't much, just the faintest flicker of something different in his cursed energy. Not quite positive, but no longer entirely negative. Shoko raised a brow. Huh, that's better than I expected. Percy smirked. Told you, he's a fast learner. Shoko shook her head, but there was amusement in her voice. It's still going to take time. He needs to practice, and even if he gets it, using it mid-fight is a whole different level of difficulty. It doesn't matter, Percy said. We'll make it work. Inamaki exhaled, flicking his fingers before glancing at Shoko with determination. Shoko sighed again, rubbing her temples. All right, fine. I'll schedule lessons when I have time. Just don't expect me to hold your hand through it. Inamaki dipped his head in gratitude. As they left, Percy nudged him. Think you can figure it out? Inamaki hummed. Salmon. Percy grinned. That's what I like to hear. All right, everyone. That is the end of chapters 14 and 15. I wasn't expecting to do both. I was expecting to just do 14, and then it was only 7 minutes, and I was like, you know what? I might as well do 15 too. And as you can see, that made this video a whole lot longer than I was planning. But because I haven't read 2 chapters in a video in a while, and I also did not remember how long this chapter was. So yeah, it was a good workout for my voice though. I don't know if you can tell, but my throat hurts right now because I haven't read for as long as I just did in one sitting in a while. I think it's been since like the last long chapter of Coral Palace, which was like 3 or 4 months ago, if not more than that. Um, so yeah. Anyway, don't really have too much to talk about. Oh, it's almost Valentine's. So, I'll tell you how that goes next Sunday because I'm hoping to be able to do something with my girlfriend, but she's also super busy all the time, so I might not be able to. Let's see. Oh, track season's starting soon, so I'll be doing that. Um, um, oh, I got really into Danny Phantom recently, so if I find a good fic that I could do for Danny Phantom, I might, because it's a pretty good series. I do highly recommend to anybody who's interested, because it is really good. And even if you're not super interested in the actual series, just scroll through Pinterest posts. They're funny, and they're interesting. Um, so that's how I got into the whole fandom thing. And oh, the next long fic I'm gonna do is going to be a Demon Slayer one called The Mist Protects, because I finished it a while back and it's really good, like really really good. Um, yeah, so that's what I'm gonna do after this one. I don't know if I'll start doing another fic alongside it. I might, if I find one that I like, but for probably the remainder of this one, I'm just going to be sticking to one fic. So you'll get updates for this every week. And I will go back to Coral Palace if I can get it working, or if I get a slightly better setup than just my phone, because I think my phone is the problem. But yeah. Um, anyway, I hope you all have a good night or day wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!